The morning of the wedding was the kind of morning that Montfort House had learned to perform rather than feel. Bright with the industry of preparation, heavy with the silence of things no one was saying. Mary Whitcomb moved through it as she had moved through every morning for 18 months. Invisibly, purposefully, with the practiced efficiency of a woman whose hands knew this house so thoroughly she could tend it in complete darkness, which was, in certain important ways, exactly what she had been doing. She had been waiting for 3 days. 3 days since the garden, since the words Lady Vivian spoke to no one she believed was listening. 3 days since Mary had watched His Grace's face from her position among the rosebeds, had seen the devastation arrive, and then, more slowly and more terribly, watched it settle into resignation. 3 days of setting out breakfast that he ate without tasting, of pressing the cravat he wore without seeing, of preparing a house for a ceremony that the man at its center had decided to endure rather than choose. She had told herself he would act, that a man who had loved Lady Eleanor genuinely, completely, in the way that left a person fundamentally altered by loss, could not have heard what Vivian said in that garden and continued forward. She had told herself that grief did not hollow a person so thoroughly that cruelty witnessed became cruelty accepted. She had told herself many things in 3 days. In her apron pocket, folded and refolded through 18 months of careful keeping, rested the letter. Eleanor's handwriting on the outside, faded now with handling. "When the moment arrives, Mary, you will know it." She had doubted herself for 18 months. She did not doubt herself this morning. The chapel bells began. 200 guests arranged themselves in expectation. Lady Vivian Ashcroft moved toward the altar with the grace of someone who would rehearse this moment for considerably longer than the engagement had lasted, and Duke Alaric Montfort stood at the front of the assembly with the expression of a man walking toward something he had decided to survive rather than live. Mary's hand closed around the letter in her pocket. She stepped forward. "Welcome to the diary. Here at Heiress Diaries, we don't just tell stories, we explore the intensity of the human heart. Subscribe to stay connected. We're delivering regular doses of the unexpectable right here." Lady Eleanor had loved her roses the way she loved most things, quietly, consistently, and with more knowledge than she ever thought necessary to mention. Mary had learned this over 6 years of service that began as formal employment and became something considerably more difficult to name. She pressed Eleanor's gowns and arranged her correspondence and anticipated her needs with the accuracy of someone paying close attention to a person worth paying close attention to. Eleanor noticed. Eleanor, unlike most of the people Mary had served, noticed everything. The roses were Mary's now, in the way that things become yours when you tend them long enough after the person who loved them is gone. She came to the garden every morning because Eleanor had, and because the alternative, letting the roses decline along with everything else grief had already claimed, felt like a betrayal she wasn't prepared to commit. She was deadheading the late blooms when Lady Vivian entered through the far gate. Vivian didn't see her. This was not unusual. Mary had spent 6 years perfecting the particular stillness that rendered her invisible among the rosebeds, and Vivian had spent 6 months demonstrating a careful lack of interest in anyone below a certain social altitude. She watched Vivian pause at Eleanor's favorite rose, a pale yellow climber that Eleanor had cultivated from a cutting her own mother had given her, and something in Vivian's expression shifted. The tender performance of appropriate sentiment so carefully maintained in visible spaces simply dissolved. "Sentimental nonsense," Vivian said quietly to no one she believed present. "The roses, the charities, the devoted staff, all of it gone within the month. A new duchess requires a house that reflects her, not a shrine to a woman no one needs to remember anymore." Mary's hands went still on the pruning shears. Then she saw him, His Grace at the garden's edge, a small wrapped gift hanging forgotten at his side, his face moving through devastation and arriving, with terrible slowness, at resignation. He had heard every word, and he was already turning away. She waited for him to act because she could not imagine that he wouldn't. The first day, she told herself he was processing the wound of it, that a man who had loved Eleanor genuinely required time to reconcile what he'd heard with the person he'd believed Vivian to be. She set out his breakfast and watched him eat without tasting it, and told herself that grief complicated everything, that he would find his footing. The second day, she told herself he was determining how to proceed with dignity, that dissolving an engagement of this magnitude required careful navigation, that the contracts and families involved demanded consideration before action. She pressed his evening jacket and told herself that deliberation was not the same as surrender. The third day, she stopped telling herself things and simply watched him move through the final wedding preparations with the hollow compliance of a man who had made his decision and was now simply waiting for it to be over. Eleanor had pressed the letter into her hands 3 days before dying, when speech had already become an effort and clarity came in intervals. When Alaric is about to make a choice that will cost him his own integrity, she had said, each word carefully spent, give him this. Not before, not after, when. Mary understood the instruction. She had questioned in the 18 months since whether she had the standing to interpret it. She was a maid. The letter was a duchess's final communication to her husband. The distance between those two facts kept the letter in her pocket through 6 months of Vivian's campaign and 3 days of Alaric's silence. That night, she lay in her narrow room with the letter resting on her chest and the garden scene replaying with the pitiless accuracy of things witnessed rather than imagined. She knew what Eleanor had meant by when. She had always known. She had simply been waiting to find the courage that knowing required. The Eleanor that grief had made of her was softer than the original. Mary had noticed this, the way memory, left to its own devices, smoothed away the edges of a person and replaced them with something more comfortable to mourn. The Eleanor that Montfort House mourned was gentle and gracious and warmly remembered. All of this was true, none of it was complete. The complete Eleanor had opinions that made her husband uncomfortable and pursued them anyway. She had looked at the women who made Montfort House function, who rose before the family and retired after them and spent their days in labor that rendered them invisible, and had decided, with characteristic quiet determination, that invisible did not mean inconsequential. The Servants' Benevolent Society had been Eleanor's particular project for the final 4 years of her life. She had funded it from her personal accounts, navigated the social resistance of women who found the whole enterprise slightly embarrassing, and built an organization that provided medical care and legal counsel and emergency housing for domestic workers whose employers had decided that loyalty ran in one direction only. 43 women in the past year alone had passed through its support. Mary knew this because she had helped Eleanor keep the records. She also knew what it had cost: the quiet arguments with Alaric about appropriate use of her funds, the society invitations that stopped arriving from certain houses whose staff she had assisted, the careful management of a reputation that could not afford to become inconvenient. Eleanor had known she was dying for longer than she had told anyone. She had used that time to put her affairs in order, the organizations properly funded and structured to survive her, the people she trusted placed where their knowledge would matter, the letter written and given to the one person she was certain would know when to use it. Not because Mary was merely loyal, because Eleanor had understood, with the clarity she brought to most things, that Mary had been paying attention for 6 years, and attention, properly directed, was its own form of power. To understand Vivian Ashcroft properly, Mary had decided, you had to resist the temptation to make her simple. She was not a foolish woman performing virtue she didn't possess. She was an intelligent woman who had assessed a situation with considerable accuracy and responded to it with considerable skill. Alaric was grieving, lonely, and sufficiently self-aware to distrust obvious calculation. He required something that felt like genuine feeling. Vivian had provided it. The campaign had begun 6 months ago, with condolences so perfectly pitched they had moved 3 separate guests to tears at the Harrington dinner. Not excessive grief, that would have seemed presumptuous, but a quiet, considered sorrow for a woman she had known only slightly, expressed with the restraint that suggested depths of feeling too dignified to fully display. Mary had watched Alaric's posture change across the dinner table, had watched him lean almost imperceptibly towards someone who seemed to understand loss without requiring him to explain it. After that, the progression had been methodical. Vivian never replaced Eleanor. She positioned herself as Eleanor's natural continuation, the woman who admired what Eleanor had built, who respected what Eleanor had meant to this household, who wanted nothing more than to honor that legacy while offering Alaric a future that Eleanor herself would surely have desired for him. The performance was nearly flawless. Nearly, because performances require consistency, and consistency requires that the performer never believe themselves unobserved. In the parlor, Vivian spoke of Eleanor's charitable work with warm appreciation. In the garden, alone, she had called it sentimental nonsense and given it a month. Mary had spent 6 months cataloging the distance between those two women. The catalog was extensive, the distance was absolute, and the woman who would become Duchess of Montfort tomorrow was entirely the one who had spoken in the garden, the parlor version having served its purpose and awaiting retirement. Montfort House on a wedding morning operated like a mechanism that had been wound too tightly and set running regardless of what anyone actually wanted. Mary moved through it with practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that great houses required their staff to function independently of feeling. She arranged flowers that had been arranged adequately already. She confirmed with the kitchen that preparations were proceeding on schedule. She ensured the chapel had been properly aired and that the guest accommodations had been adequately attended. Her hands performed these tasks with complete competence, while the rest of her existed in the strange, suspended state of someone waiting for a moment that has not yet arrived, but no longer distant. She saw Alaric once in the corridor outside his dressing room, while his valet was making final adjustments to his coat. He looked like a man who had slept badly and dressed carefully to compensate. Everything externally correct, nothing internally settled. He met her eyes for a moment in the way that people sometimes meet the eyes of servants when they have forgotten to maintain the habit of looking through them. He had not forgotten the garden. She could see it in his face as clearly as she had seen the resignation arrive 3 days ago. He knew exactly what he had heard and exactly what he was choosing to endure. The knowledge sat behind his expression like something he had decided to carry rather than set down. It was this, not Vivian's words in the garden, not 3 sleepless nights, not even Eleanor's letter, that finally resolved the question Mary had been turning over for 18 months. Eleanor had given her the letter because she understood that grief could make a good man choose comfort over truth, and she had given it to Mary because she understood something else, that the person with the knowledge is not always the person with the power, but they are sometimes the only person with the courage. Mary's hand moved from her apron to her pocket. Her fingers closed around the letter. She carried it the rest of the morning in her hand rather than against her hip, and the difference was small and absolute. The chapel at Montfort House had been built for occasions of exactly this weight, and it bore the assembled 200 with the quiet confidence of stone that had witnessed several generations of consequential moments. Mary stood with the household staff along the western wall, and the precise position that 6 years of service had taught her was appropriate for ceremonies of this kind. Invisible by placement as much as habit, present because great occasions required witnessing, and the people who witnessed them most faithfully were generally the ones no one thought to look at. Vivian was luminous. This was simply true, and Mary noted it without particular feeling. The cream gown, the careful arrangement of her expression into something that communicated both joy and appropriate solemnity. It was the finest performance of a 6-month campaign, and it was very fine indeed. Alarg spoke his responses in the measured tones of a man whose voice had been trained to convey composure, regardless of its contents. The officiant reached the passage that preceded the vows. The moment that had been approaching for 3 days arrived without announcement, as moments do, simply by becoming the present rather than the future. Mary stepped forward. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She moved from the western wall into the visible space of the ceremony with the deliberate purpose of someone who has made a decision and is now simply carrying it out. The silence that followed was not the silence of outrage. That would come later. It was the silence of 200 people registering simultaneously that something was happening that did not fit any category they had prepared for. Your Grace. Her voice was steady. I was Lady Eleanor's maid for 6 years. 3 days ago, in the Rose Garden, I heard Lady Vivian speak of my mistress when she believed no one was listening. I believe you heard it also. She described what had been said, plainly, without embellishment, the specific words, the specific contempt, the specific intentions Vivian had expressed for everything Eleanor had built. Then she held out the letter. Lady Eleanor asked me to give you this when the moment required it. I believe it does. Vivian's recovery was genuinely impressive. The tears arrived within seconds, not the flooding grief of someone overwhelmed, but the precise moisture of someone wounded in their dignity, which was a considerably more socially sympathetic condition. Her hands clasped at her chest, her expression arranged itself into something that communicated bewildered hurt rather than alarm, and the effect on the assembled guests was immediate and observable. Her voice caught with practiced delicacy. I cannot imagine what would compel a servant to say such things, on such a day, in such a setting. She turned toward Alaric with the particular helplessness of someone who has never needed to defend themselves against staff before and finds the experience deeply beneath them. Alaric, surely you cannot. The whispers moved through the chapel like weather. Mary heard them without looking for their sources. Extraordinary presumption. The woman is a maid. Grief does strange things to attached servants. Poor Lady Vivian. The social machinery of 200 aristocratic guests processing a class transgression operated with remarkable efficiency, and its conclusion was assembling itself before anyone had examined the evidence. The pressure on Alaric was visible and immediate. To dismiss what he was hearing, to restore the ceremony's dignity, to return Mary to the western wall and the invisibility appropriate to her station, thereby allowing the mourning to proceed as planned and everyone present to pretend that nothing of consequence had occurred. Mary stood in the center of all of it and did not move. She was aware with considerable clarity of precisely how exposed she was. The letter was in Alaric's hands now, out of hers, beyond her control, dependent entirely on a man whose capacity for courage she had watched fail 3 days prior. She had made a promise to Eleanor in a private room. It had seemed sufficient then. In front of 200 witnesses, with Vivian's tears and the chapel's whispers pressing from every direction, she understood for the first time what keeping it would actually cost. She remained standing. There was nothing else to do. Alaric stood at the altar with Eleanor's letter in his hands and did not move for a long moment. The chapel held its collective breath in the way that large groups of people sometimes hold it when they understand without being told that what happens next will be remembered. Vivian's tears continued their precise work. The officiant stood in the particular paralysis of a man whose ceremonial authority had not prepared him for this category of interruption. Then Alaric unfolded the letter and began to read it aloud. Eleanor's voice entered the chapel 18 months after her death with the same quality it had possessed in life, direct, without performance, carrying the particular authority of someone who had never needed volume to be heard. She had written that she was not afraid of being replaced. She had written that she wanted for him exactly what she had always wanted, a partnership built on the foundation of knowing and being known, rather than the more comfortable arrangement of presenting and being accepted. She had written that grief would make him vulnerable to the latter, that loneliness was a very effective argument for settling, and that she trusted him to remember the difference when the moment required it. The final lines she had written were these: "A person who performs kindness for an audience and practices contempt in private is showing you two versions of themselves. One is what they want you to see. The other is what they are. I have loved you too well to leave you without the means of telling them apart." The whispers stopped. Vivian's composure did not shatter dramatically. It simply became insufficient, a performance that required believers, and the audience was no longer available for that purpose. Alaric folded the letter with care. He looked not at Vivian, but at Mary, still standing in the center of the chapel, and his expression carried something that had not been in his face for 3 days. "She trusted you with this," he said quietly, "when I did not trust myself." It was not absolution, it was acknowledgement, which was more useful. Vivian departed Montfort House that afternoon with the compressed efficiency of someone who understood that prolonging the situation served none of her remaining interests. The engagement was dissolved through the quiet machinery of solicitors and correspondence, handled with the dignity that Alaric had finally, belatedly summoned. There was no dramatic confrontation, there was simply an ending, which was its own kind of justice. The household absorbed the morning's events in the way that households absorb consequential things, through the gradual restoration of ordinary work, through the resumption of duties that had continued through every previous difficulty and would continue through this one. But something had shifted in the bearing of the staff who had loved Eleanor. Something that had been held carefully, provisionally, for 18 months had been permitted to settle. Mary noticed it in small ways: the cook who hummed while she worked for the first time since Eleanor's death, the footman who paused before Eleanor's portrait with something other than grief. Mary returned to the rose garden the following morning because it required tending, and because she had always come, and because the promise she had made was kept now, but the work it had been protecting was not finished. Alaric found her there. He stood at the garden's edge for a moment in a way that reminded her, painfully, of 3 days prior, and then he came in rather than turning away. He told her that Eleanor's charitable organizations would be formally endowed and that he required someone to administer them who understood what they were and what they were for. He told her that 6 years of faithful attention constituted knowledge that deserved institutional recognition. He told her that Eleanor had always said Mary understood the work better than anyone. Mary accepted the role without excessive ceremony because Eleanor was not a woman who valued excessive ceremony, and some habits of service were worth keeping. She returned to her roses when he left. The late blooms needed deadheading. The Servants' Benevolent Society had 3 new cases requiring attention before the week's end. The organizations Eleanor had built with such careful determination continued their quiet work in the world, tended by the woman who had always understood them best. Mary Whitcomb, who had not been supposed to matter in this story, continued her mourning as she had continued every morning for 6 years, with the particular faithfulness of someone who had learned, from a woman worth learning from, that invisible work is still work, and that kept promises, however long they require keeping, have a way of eventually becoming everything. Thanks for watching. You will find the video at the upper right of the screen interesting. You should check it out.